Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 109th deck and it's titled Burn It Down. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So really quickly, before we get into the actual deck tech, I do want to take a second to highlight some ways you can help support the channel. If, of course, none of these are your thing, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. But if you're looking to go a little bit above and beyond, you can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit, u/POYNZ13. You can send us an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com, and you can also support us directly over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, where you can join the amazing people listed below: William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, and Jeffrey Bowes. To the 6 of you, thank you all so much. And if you're looking to join that group of people and get access to things like the deck lists a week early, joining a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games. So if you've ever wanted to be in the games that are featured on this channel, that is a great way to do it. You'll get a random card sent to you every month. It's one of the random cards of the week as a thank you from me to you. And of course, you also get access to the unedited gameplay videos, so you can hear the players talking and laughing and having a good time, rather than just my own narration over top of it and a shortened version of it. And finally, of course, in my opinion, the most important thing you get is the guarantee that I will take any of your suggestions and turn them into decks for this channel. It might take me a while because I do have quite a list going so far, but I will get to them. I am happy to try to get to anyone else's suggestions as well, but I can't promise to get to them in the same way that I can our patrons. So if there's a deck that you really want to see made and you want to guarantee that it gets made, check us out on Patreon. And like I said, if none of that is your style, you can just like and subscribe. That does help out, and I am more than happy to do my best with the suggestions, even if they're just given in the comments or maybe any of our social media accounts as well. So without any more rambling from me, let's jump into our deck tech. And of course, to start our deck tech, we got to talk about our random card of the week. Now, I will admit, this is a suggested card. I did not put the person's name up here for the suggestion because, for those who don't know, I am a teacher as well, and this was actually suggested to me by one of my students who I taught how to play Magic, because he fell in love with the burn style strategy and wanted to see if we could make a commander deck around a burn style strategy. So he suggested that we build around Neheb the Eternal. So of course, I can't say no to that request. And personally, Neheb the Eternal is one of my favorite commanders. I have a personal commander deck built around him that I love a lot. Unfortunately, it does not hit our $100 budget limit, so it is not that deck, but it is still a ton of fun. So we are building Neheb the Eternal. This is 3 red for a 4/6 legendary creature. Zombie Minotaur Warrior, has afflict 3, so whenever this creature becomes blocked, defending player loses 3 life. And at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, add a red to your mana pool for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So obviously, it goes without saying, if our random card of the week is a legendary creature, that of course means that they are also our commander. Now, it is a little bit tough seeing our commander be $26 because that is a quarter of our budget right there, but luckily there are a lot of really good red cards that we can play in this deck that don't exactly break the bank. So let's talk about some of our themes and kind of look at how we built this deck, see if we can make burn work in Commander when we're trying to knock out 3 opponents with 40 life rather than 1 opponent with 20. So the first thing we're going to have to do with this deck is make sure we have effects that target each opponent. So for example, we have Firebrand Archer, which is 1 and a red for a 2/1 human archer. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Firebrand Archer deals 1 damage to each opponent. That doesn't sound like a lot, but you have to keep in mind we're probably not going to use this damage to be winning the game. We're going to be using this damage to make mana with Neheb. Neheb makes red mana for each life our opponents have lost, so something like Firebrand Archer actually gives us 3 mana with Neheb if we're playing against 3 opponents. And that can get out of hand very, very quickly, because if we just cast 3 spells before we go to combat, we do 3 damage to each opponent, we get to make 9 mana at the end of our second main phase and be able to just kind of do whatever we're trying to do, because at that point, we've just made a bunch of mana, done a ton of damage, and hopefully we're going to continue doing that damage. Now, that does lead us to our second theme, because if we're making that much mana, what exactly do we do with it? And the short answer is we sink it into X spells. We find a bunch of spells that we can put as much mana into as we want and do that much damage. So a great example of that is Fireball, which is X and a red for a sorcery. As an additional cost to play Fireball, pay 1 for each target beyond the first. Fireball deals X damage divided evenly, rounded down among any number of target creatures and or players. So if we, in our first example, made 9 mana with Firebrand Archer, we can put 8 mana into Fireball, so it's X and a red, so that's 9 total mana if X is 8, and do 8 damage divided as we choose, provided we pay more mana, but in this case, we'll say we hit one target to do 8 damage to someone else. That means that they took 3 damage from Firebrand Archer and the 8 damage from Fireball, so we just did a ton of damage in one turn while really just kind of playing our game plan, doing what we want to be doing, and making sure that we have the cards either in hand or in play to give us mana to do damage and keep our train rolling. And that's going to lead us to our final theme of the deck, which is we need to make sure that we're doing as much damage as possible. So we are going to be playing cards like Torbrand Thane of Redfell, which is 1 red, red, red for a 2/4 legendary creature dwarf noble. If a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent that opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 2 instead. So now, Firebrand Archer isn't doing 1 damage to each opponent whenever we cast a non-creature spell, it's doing 3 damage to each opponent. So now to make that 9 mana, we don't have to cast 3 spells, we only have to cast 1. And that also means that Fireball, instead of doing 8 damage, would now do 10 damage. So Torbrand is really going to turbocharge this deck and make sure that all the small damage we're doing to gain a ton of mana to cast our bigger spells is going to add up significantly more quickly, because Torbrand's going to, in some cases, be doubling or tripling the amount of damage that's dealt. Yeah, it doesn't do quite as much for something like Fireball because the difference between 8 and 10 isn't that great, but the difference between 1 and 3 for Firebrand Archer is huge. So Torbrand is phenomenal, and he's of course not the only effect we have in the deck that does this. We've got plenty of ways to double up or increase the damage we are doing. So those are our themes. This is our mono red burn deck for Commander. And of course, the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some key cards. These are the cards that, while they may not necessarily be win conditions, and spoilers, one of them kind of is, they're still incredibly powerful and great ways for us to jump ahead in the game. So the first key card I want to talk about is Leyline Tyrant. And Leyline Tyrant is a pretty recent addition to my personal Neheb deck as well, and it is an absolute powerhouse in this style of deck, because Leyline Tyrant is 2 red for a 4/4 dragon, has flying, you don't lose unspent red mana as steps and phases end. When Leyline Tyrant dies, you may pay any amount of red. When you do, it deals that much damage to any target. So if we go back to our previous example where we made 9 mana, we now don't have to spend that mana in our second main phase. We can pass the turn and leave that red mana floating, meaning maybe we can do something at the end of an opponent's turn, or we just save up that mana, use it again next turn. And if for some reason we just don't spend the mana and Leyline Tyrant dies, we still have that 9 red mana floating that can then just deal that much damage to any target. So Leyline Tyrant is perfect for this deck and is a perfect partner for Neheb, because no matter what we're doing, we're getting value out of it. Whether we're spending the extra mana or doing damage with the extra mana, either way, we're forwarding our game plan. Our next key card is going to be Jaya's Immolating Inferno, which is X red for a legendary sorcery, which means we can only cast it if we control a legendary creature or planeswalker. Hopefully we'll have Neheb to do this. And Jaya's Immolating Inferno deals X damage to each of up to 3 targets. So unlike Fireball that we talked about earlier, where we had to divide the damage among all the targets, Jaya's Immolating Inferno just picks 3 targets and does X damage. So if X is If we made 9 mana, X would be 7. We're not doing 7 damage divided among 3 targets. We are doing 7 damage to 3 targets. That is a total of 21 damage that we can just divide out as we choose. And that's a pretty minimal example. If for some reason we can get X to be 10, 15, maybe even 20, then all of a sudden we're doing 20 damage to each opponent. And that can very, very quickly close out the game, especially if we've already done damage up to that point. So Jaya's Immolating Inferno is by far one of the best fireball effects we have in the deck, because it can just very easily divide all the damage and do what we want it to do. And finally, that brings us to the last key card, which is, again, one of my personal favorite cards in this deck. It is Heartless Hidetsugu. So Heartless Hidetsugu is 3 red for a 4/3 legendary creature ogre shaman. It can tap, and Heartless Hidetsugu deals damage to each player equal to half that player's life total rounded down. So this is incredibly powerful with Neheb, because we tap it, say every single player is at 40 life, tap Heartless Hidetsugu, it's going to do 20 damage to each player. That does include us, so you do have to be very careful with this card because it will also hit the person using it. But that means that each opponent has now lost 20 life. If we have Neheb in play, that's a total of 60 life lost among our opponents, making us 60 red mana. Then at that point, if we have Jaya's Immolating Inferno in hand, we can just pump 58 mana into X, do 58 damage to each of our opponents, and just straight up win the game right there. So Heartless Hidetsugu is phenomenal in this deck, but there's another piece of this that's going to be very important, because we talked earlier about having ways to kind of double up our damage. If we have a card in play that doubles the damage of anything else, Heartless Hidetsugu is just a one-shot kill machine by tapping it and doing damage to each player equal to half of their life total, which is doubled, which is their entire life total. Now it is rounded down, so if someone is at an even life total, that will automatically knock them out of the game. But if someone is at an odd life total, they survive. I think they survive at 1, but it might also be that they survive at 3. I'm not 100% sure on that one, because I'll be honest, I'm not great at math. So if you know, please let me know in the comments. But Heartless Hidetsugu is just a monster in this deck and absolutely worth a slot in our key cards. However, this is not the only set of cards that I want to highlight, because just because these are the key cards doesn't mean we can't talk about some cool interactions. So I would like to highlight some cards that I think work super well together, and sometimes, and in this case, are just cards that I personally enjoy and I think should be shown off. So the first set of cool interactions is going to be between Pyromancer's Goggles and Comet Storm. And yes, I know we just talked about Comet Storm in the last video as well. Turns out Comet Storm, just a really good card. But Pyromancer's Goggles, we'll start there, is 5 mana for a legendary artifact that can tap, add a red mana. When that mana is spent to cast a red spell that is an instant or sorcery, we copy that spell and you may choose new targets for the copy. I'm sure you can kind of already see where this is going, because Comet Storm is X red for an instant with multi-kicker 1. Choose any target, then choose another target for each time this spell was kicked. Comet Storm deals X damage to each of them. The nice thing about copying a kicked spell, which is what we would hopefully be doing with the Goggles and the Comet Storm, is that the copied spell retains the information that it had when it was cast, which means the copy is also going to be kicked the number of times that the original was. So if we use Pyromancer's Goggles to cast Comet Storm, let's say X is 10, and we multi-kick it once. So we are doing Comet Storm X equals 10 to 2 targets. We're doing 10 damage to each of 2 targets. Pyromancer's Goggles will copy that exact statistic, meaning that the copy of our Comet Storm will also do 10 damage to 2 targets. So we could make this incredibly huge spell where Comet Storm is 10, 15, 20 mana, multi-kicked, 2, 3, 4 times, and also copy it with the Goggles, meaning that we can dish out a ton of damage, and this can effectively eliminate players, it can wipe the board, it can do anything we need it to do in any given moment. And more than any other cool interaction that we're really going to mention, this is probably the easiest way to win a game if we can get a ton of mana, maybe with something like Heartless Hidetsugu. And I really wanted to highlight that because both of these cards are phenomenal in this deck, but together they are just absolutely absurd. So that leads us then to our second cool interaction, and that is going to be between Drakuseth, Maw of Flames, and Null Spine Dragon. So we haven't talked about it too much because we focused on the X spells, but since we're making so much mana, we do of course also need to have some big payoffs, and those typically tend to come in the form of dragons. So our first one, Drakuseth, Maw of Flames, is 4 red for a legendary creature, dragon. It's a 7/7 with flying, and whenever Drakuseth Maw of Flames attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target and 3 damage to each of up to 2 other targets. And if we combine that up with Null Spine Dragon, which is 5 red for a creature, dragon, 7/5, flying, when Null Spine Dragon enters the battlefield, you may discard your hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt to target opponent this turn. So Drakuseth on its own does 7 damage to an opponent when it attacks, does 4 damage to something on attacks, and 3 damage to 2 other things when it attacks. Which means that if we do the 4 damage to the thing, well, I say thing, it's most likely going to be the player. We do 4 damage to the player that we attack. That's a total of 11 damage dealt to a single player, giving us 11 mana with Neheb, possibly even 6 more if we do the 3 damage to our other opponents. Then Null Spine Dragon can come down in our second main phase and draw us 11 cards because Drakuseth just did 11 damage. And if we've made a ton of mana with Neheb, then all of a sudden we can cast those cards. We can cast all the fireballs and all the firebrand archers, maybe some mana rocks, some things that we're going to need out of those 11 cards we just drew, and essentially refill our hand, refill our board, keep doing damage. And just these 2 alone can really close out a game very, very quickly. And yes, we only get the draw from Null Spine Dragon once, but the way this deck functions, we want to do a bunch of damage to a single target at any given time, so Null Spine Dragon is really always going to draw us cards. I just think that Drakuseth is the easiest way to get it to draw a ton of cards all at once. So that is our cool interaction number 2, and honestly just a way for me to talk about some fun dragons as well. So let's move to the last piece of our deck tech, which is of course going to be the price. Now this week we did come in pretty close to the $100 budget limit at $96.43. And a good portion of that is because our commander is $26. So if you wanted to try to swap Neheb out for a different commander, you could. You could drop the price down to about $70. But I don't think cutting the commander that we're built around is a great idea because there really isn't a good replacement for Neheb. You can play other cards in the command slot. We do have Torbrand that we've talked about. We have the other Neheb Dreadhorde General in here as well. But they don't do quite as much as Neheb the Eternal. So I think that if you do replace the commander, this becomes a different deck entirely and doesn't run quite as smoothly. So rather than talking about Neheb, let's focus on our second most expensive card, which is Chandra's Ignition. And that one sits at $6.78. So even just removing this, you can drop the deck's price down to about $90, which is a bit more manageable than $96, but not too great in the long run. However, if you are able to keep Chandra's Ignition in the deck, I do highly recommend it because Chandra's Ignition is 3 red for a sorcery that says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each other creature and each opponent. The nice thing about this is that if we use it with Neheb, who is a 4/6, we could do 4 damage to each opponent, go to combat, presumably hit our opponents because we just did 4 damage to all their creatures as well, and then make a ton of mana because each opponent took 4, all their creatures took 4, they maybe took another 4 from Neheb when he attacked. So Chandra's Ignition acts as a board wipe, it acts as removal, it acts as mana production if we have our commander. And if we don't have Neheb and we just want to put it on something that's, say, a 10/10, that's just a ton of damage being dealt to each opponent and to each creature. So Chandra's Ignition is very, very strong, and I do think that there are other decks that are better suited to it, but it's not the worst deck to have it in. So if you can have it, I think it's very good, but if you do need to cut it for budget reasons, the deck can, of course, survive without it. On the other hand, though, if you're looking for a card to add to the deck that is definitely out of the budget limit, but it is incredibly strong in this deck, I do have a suggestion for you. And only one suggestion this week, but that's mainly because it is incredibly expensive and also incredibly powerful for what Neheb is trying to do. And that card is Aggravated Assault. So Aggravated Assault is 2 and a red for an enchantment, and it says 3 red, untap all creatures you control. After this phase, there is an additional combat phase, followed by an additional main phase. Play this ability only anytime you could play a sorcery. So, if you can't tell right up front, this can go infinite with Neheb very, very easily, because all we have to do is make sure that we've done 5 damage to any opponent. Doesn't even matter if it's the same opponent, different opponents. We go to combat. We move to our second main phase. Neheb triggers. We generate 5 mana. We then put that 5 mana back into Aggravated Assault. We get an additional combat phase. And then when we get our additional main phase after that, Neheb actually triggers again. So we make the mana again. So as long as we are making 5 mana, we get infinite combat phases and additional second main phases. So all we've got to do is make sure that we have some avenue of attack. Maybe Neheb keeps getting blocked by a 1/1, but he has Afflict 3, so he's doing more damage. Or maybe there's an opponent who just doesn't have any blockers, and we can keep attacking that opponent. Because the way that this is going to work is it's actually going to stack. So if we make 5 mana after the end of our first combat, and we attack an opponent for 4, now when we go to our next main phase, we actually make 9 mana because our opponents have lost a total of 9 life this turn. Then we pay into Aggravated Assault again, we still have 4 mana to do something with, and we keep the train rolling. Every time we hit our opponents, we get more and more mana in each of our additional main phases after each of our additional combat phases. And if we have maybe just like a dragon in play and none of our opponents have any flyers, that just straight up wins the game. Or if we can get to the point where we have a Leyline Tyrant and we're saving all the mana, we can then just pump it into Leyline Tyrant. If we have ways to pump it into Fireball or Comet Storm, you kind of get the idea, and this is why I really wanted to talk about this card, because if you're looking to win the game, Aggravated Assault does that very, very quickly and very, very easily, which is why it's $38 and definitely out of our price range. So obviously, if we were to put in Aggravated Assault, we would have to take a card out of our deck, and the card that I would recommend taking out is actually Defiler of Instinct, which is 2 red for a 4/4 Phyrexian Kavu. It has First Strike, and as an additional cost to cast red permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost red less to cast if you paid life this way. This effect reduces only the amount of red mana you pay. Whenever you cast a red permanent spell, Defiler of Instinct deals 1 damage to any target. So Defiler of Instinct is great. The issue that we were running into with this deck is that we don't have a ton of red permanent spells. We have a lot of red instants and sorceries, and a lot of our permanents actually tend to be colorless. So it would trigger once in a while, but not as often as it was to be relevant. Plus, it only did 1 damage to any target rather than each opponent. And we don't really have a need for the reducing cost effect on this. Being able to pay 2 life instead of a red mana isn't super relevant for our deck because we generate a bunch of mana at any given time. So Defiler of Instinct in practice, not super great, at least not as great as I thought it was in theory. So I'm not saying it's a bad card, but I don't think this is the deck for it. So if you're able to swap it out for Aggravated Assault, I would highly recommend that. But that is the end of our deck tech, and obviously, we can talk about this deck all we want, but we're not really going to get the sense of it until we see it in a game. So we are going to run this deck up against 3 separate opponents this week, and if you're interested, by the way, this game was played over on Eddie's channel over on Twitch, which I will put a link to in the description of the video if you want to see it in its entirely without having to subscribe to the Patreon. So there's a little bit of a sneak peek for you. But our opponents this week, we are joined by LK, living up to his name, Lord Kaiju, bringing literally a Kaiju in Gigan Cyberclaw Terror, otherwise known as Gyruda, Doom of Depths. And this is going to be a massive demon kraken. He wants to basically play a ton of clone effects, so he can play Gyruda, get a clone out of his graveyard, copy Gyruda, do it again, get another clone, copy it again, and just kind of get a ton of value from things entering the battlefield, entering the graveyard, making his stuff super big, and just kind of outvaluing his opponents. I haven't actually played against a Gyruda deck. I remember it when it was in Standard, kind of being a menace, so I'm interested to see if it's the same in Commander. Next up, we have Rith the Awakener, which is being played by Fudge. And Fudge's Rith deck, from what I can understand, is just kind of a ramp and put creatures into play, which I'm a big fan of, and I think that they're going to probably bring a pretty strong deck. I know the few times I've played with Fudge, they brought very powerful decks, so I wouldn't be surprised to see some massive dragons and massive creatures hitting the board probably a lot sooner than anticipated, and I'm hoping that we can kind of burn out Fudge, or maybe Fudge will help us kind of burn out the other players, but we will see. And then last but not least, we have Eddie, unfortunately going last in his own stream. So he is playing Osgir the Reconstructor, and this is an artifact deck. Specifically, I believe it's an artifact creature deck. He wants to be making sure to cast as many artifact creatures as possible and kind of win through kind of some value shenanigans, being able to exile them from his graveyard to make 2 copies of them. And most Osgir decks I've seen have been incredibly powerful and incredibly combo-centric, and I don't know if that is what Eddie is trying to do, but that does make me very wary. So I think looking at these 3 opponents, I do have to pick Eddie as the deck that I'm the most concerned about. Hopefully our burn strategy can get there just a little bit quicker than whatever his artifact shenanigans are going to be doing, but let me know in the comments which opponent you think is going to be the most of a threat to our deck. Let me know if there's anything in the game that you find a little bit entertaining, if there's anything weird about it. I just want to hear all the feedback and comments, so please let me know what you think. Otherwise, I hope you are all very excited for this game. I know I certainly am, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, LK goes first, followed by myself, Fudge, and then Eddie. On LK's first turn, he plays a Temple of Deceit, scrying 1. I play a Mountain. Fudge plays a Spire Garden, then casts Exploration, being able to play an additional land on their turn, letting them play a Plains. Eddie plays a Temple of Triumph, scrying 1. LK plays a Watery Grave untapped, paying 2 life, then cast Cold Steel Heart, naming black when it enters so that it taps for black mana. I play a Mountain. Fudge plays a Mountain, then cast Kodama's Reach, searching their library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into their hand. On Eddie's turn, he plays a Mountain. On LK's turn, he casts a Bantu's Monument, making all his black creatures cost 1 less, and making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever he casts a creature. After that, he plays an Evolving Wilds, immediately sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. On my turn, I cast Flame Rift, doing 4 damage to each player, but unfortunately, I also miss my 3rd land drop. Fudge casts Cultivate, searching their library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into their hand, playing the plains they got once the spell is resolved. Then, thanks to Exploration, Fudge is able to play Reliquary Tower as well, gaining no maximum hand size. At this point, since we're playing on Eddie's stream, check him out on Twitch by the way, his channel link is in the description of the video, Doodle redeemed some channel points to allow me to make a treasure token in the hopes I'd be able to get back into the game. On Eddie's turn, he plays a Plains, then casts Lochiel Clockwork Scholar, preventing all combat damage that would be dealt to his artifact creatures, and drawing a card whenever an artifact creature enters under his control, but only once each turn. LK casts Glen Elendra Liege, giving his other blue and or black creatures +1/+1, also making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life. On my turn, I play a Mountain and cast Cryptolith Fragment, which makes each player lose a life whenever it's tapped for mana. Fudge plays a Forest, then casts their commander Rith the Awakener, letting them pay 3 mana when it does combat damage to a player, and create X 1/1 green saplings, where X is the number of permanents in play of a color that Fudge chooses. Eddie plays a Battlefield Forge, then casts a Palladium Mirror, drawing a card with Lochiel. LK casts Mirror Hall Mimic, entering as a copy of Rith the Awakener, also making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life. On my turn, I cast an Arcane Signet, and also cast Neheb Dreadhorde Champion, making each player lose a life since I tapped the Cryptolith Fragment, and letting me discard any number of cards, draw that many cards, and make that much red mana whenever Neheb deals combat damage to a player. Fudge casts Garruk's Uprising, drawing a card since they control a creature with power 4 or greater, giving all their creatures trample, and drawing a card whenever they cast a creature with power 4 or greater. They then move to combat, attacking Eddie for 6 with Rith, paying 3 mana on damage to create 4 1/1 Saproings since there are 4 green permanents in play. On Eddie's turn, he cast a Golem Foundry, putting a charge counter on it whenever he casts an artifact spell, and letting him remove 3 counters to create a 3/3 Golem token. After that, he cast a Scrap Trawler, drawing a card and putting a counter on the Foundry, letting him return an artifact from his graveyard to his hand whenever an artifact he controls with greater mana value goes to the graveyard from the battlefield. On LK's turn, he plays a Swamp, then casts his commander Gyruda Doom of Depths, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life, and also making each player mill 4 cards. Then he's able to return a creature with an even mana value from among the cards milled to the battlefield under his control. This winds up letting him put his own Archon of Cruelty into play, forcing Fudge to sacrifice a creature, discard a card and lose 3 life, while LK draws a card and gains 3 life. He then moves to combat and attacks me for 2 with the Glen Elendra Liege. On my turn, I play a Mountain and cast my commander Neheb the Eternal, letting me make red mana in my second main phase equal to the life lost by my opponents this turn. Notably, I also tap the Fragment so each player loses a life. I then move to combat, attacking Fudge for 5, discarding 2 cards, drawing 2 cards, and making 2 red mana. Then when I move to my second main phase, my commander triggers, making me an additional 8 red mana, and this allows me to cast Heartless Hidetsugu, which can tap to do damage to each player equal to half their life total. Once that's resolved, I also cast Red Sun Zenith for X equals 5, doing 5 damage to LK and shuffling it back into my library. Fudge cast a Lotus Petal and also cast Inferno of the Star Mounts before playing a Forest and passing. Eddie plays an Exotic Orchard and casts Hedron Archive, putting a counter on Golem Foundry, and he also cast Boros Signet, putting another counter on the Foundry. Finally, he casts his commander Osgir the Reconstructor. On LK's turn, he casts Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, entering as a copy of Gyruda, except it also prevents the legend rule from applying to LK's creatures. Since this enters as Gyruda, each player mills 4, and LK puts Sakashima the Imposter into play from among the cards milled, entering as another copy of Gyruda. This Gyruda mills each player for 4 and puts Blightsteel Colossus into play. LK also gains a life while each of his opponents lose a life, thanks to the original Sakashima. He then moves to combat, attacking Fudge for 6 with the Archon, forcing them to discard a card, lose 3 life, and sacrifice a creature, attacks me for 6 with Gyruda, and attacks Eddie for 6 with Rith. Before damage though, Fudge casts Jaheira's Respite, searching their library for 3 basic land cards, putting them into play tapped since there are 3 attacking creatures. Then, more importantly, it also prevents all combat damage that would be dealt this turn, meaning we all take 0. On my turn, I play a Mountain, then cast Gratuitous Violence, doubling the damage my creatures would do. This lets me do a damage to everyone with the Cryptolith Fragment, putting myself and Eddie to odd life totals, so I can activate Hidetsugu, doing damage to each player equal to half their life total doubled, putting Eddie and I both to 1 life, but knocking out LK and Fudge. Then I'm able to just attack Eddie with Neheb, knocking him out with Afflict, and winning me the game. Alright, so that was a super sweet game. I do definitely have to give a shout out to Doodle for the assist. Giving us that treasure let us get back into the game. I don't think we necessarily needed it because we did start drawing lands pretty soon after we got that, but it was nice to have. Otherwise, I think the deck performed very, very well. It was awesome to see Neheb. Like I said earlier, I love playing this deck. This is one of my personal favorite commanders, so big fan of being able to pull out Neheb whenever I get the chance. And just being able to use Heartless Hitotsugu and a damage doubler to just knock people out of the game immediately just felt very good. It felt very powerful, and to quote the flavor text on Neheb, I believe that this is what glory looks like. So a very sweet game, very, very fun. I'm glad to see that we were able to do some cool burn shenanigans. Otherwise, I think LK's deck also did very well, and LK specifically mentioned the turn before we won that there was a chance that he was going to go off because he was able to get Sakashima in play and tried to get a ton of clones, but unfortunately fizzled a little bit sooner than anticipated, so couldn't quite go off. But I think that if he'd kept hitting clones, it could have been a very different game. Fudge also did very well, being able to get Rith in play incredibly quickly with the exploration and the back-to-back Kodama's Reach and Cultivate, and just putting like every land into play. And I think that they could probably have won if they'd been able to get a more commanding board state a little bit sooner. I think that the problem they ran into was having too many lands and not enough to do with it. So a little bit unfortunate on their end, but still very cool showing. And then last but not least, of course, Eddie, also very cool. It was nice to see Loshio come out. That is again, a personal favorite card of mine. I love seeing Loshio come out in games, but didn't quite get to do too much else. Unfortunately, he got a little bit stuck on lands as well, so not the best showing by Osgear. I'm sure that it is a very powerful deck, and we're probably all very lucky that it didn't do too much. But if you're interested in seeing more of Eddie's stuff, like I said earlier too, I will link his Twitch channel down in the comments. Go check him out. He's a great guy. He puts on great streams. So thank you to everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. Hope you enjoyed the gameplay as well. I know I certainly did. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.